Thank you so much, Dave and Jer and everybody in the festival. I'm very honored to be here tonight. In the past 20 years, I've been working in media art, and one of the things that I've learned in this 20 years is that whenever Golan Levin says, do something, I do it. And he said to me I needed to be here, and now I understand why. It's exciting to be with you all. I grabbed a couple of the panels, a couple of the presentations this morning, and I'm excited to do this last presentation today. It's only going to take 4 or 5 hours, but we have beer and the marathon. It's not going to be painful, except my S's are killing you, right? All right. So I want to just tell you very briefly, I'm a Mexican-Canadian artist. I have a joke about that. We're not Chicanos, we're Chicanadians. We're Mexicanucks, or the really offensive term for all of us is we're not wetbacks, we're very wetbacks. Because by the time you get to Canada, you're crossing Mississippi and the Great Lakes and you're soaking wet. In the past, I know, it's an old joke, but I like it. Just knowing that it's this time, what I've decided to do is to make the presentation into a lot of really short little clips of different kinds of artworks, all under the presentation title of Anti-Modular. My studio in Montreal is in fact called Anti-Modular Research, and it's just a word that we like to use to sort of emphasize that we are on the line of development that has to do more with eccentricities and with singularities and with the idea that once we get really good at one particular interface or design or programming language, we move on to another one. And so what I'll do is I'll show all of these different examples, and I've kind of broken the presentation so that it's not chronological, so that some of you who have seen my presentations before won't get too bored. So I'll start with a section of the presentation called trackers, which is basically computers which sense the public and react to its presence. In 1992, back in Macromind Director days, if you guys remember that, you probably don't, you're young. We were doing this project, which at the time was quite exciting. It's a 3D ultrasonic tracking system designed by Will Bauer. And we had dancers who would dance around, and the eye and other modules would sort of follow them. And then at the end of the performance, we'd invite the public to try it out, because that was a really important moment that they would see that it wasn't just rehearsed, that in fact that eye really did follow you. So in 1992, this was important to do, because if you remember, back then there was a lot of interest in head-mounted displays and a virtuality that somehow did not involve the body, so we wanted to create something that was a little bit more invasive. Also, in the tracking of bodies and the amplification of bodies, we very early on, I think it was 1996, we started working with shadow plays. And one of the beautiful things about shadow plays is that you have this, sort of transcultural reference, right? Every culture has a sophisticated relationship to the shadows. And the very first time that we did this particular project called Body Movies was in Rotterdam, where I found this incredible engraving by Samuel van Hoogstraten, who was using shadow plays to relate the ways in which perspective works, to teach that. And what I was interested in is this monstrous scale of the larger shadows and the angelic and pure smaller shadows. And with this as an excuse or as an inspiration, we made a project which is basically 1,200, I think that's actually 12,000 square foot interactive installation. So what we did is we placed 2 very, very powerful projectors on towers, which would project portraits of people from the city. We had over 1,000 portraits of people from the city. And then 2 very powerful projectors on the ground, and which would wash off, or you just sort of wash out the portraits on the facade of the building. And then as people would walk close to or far away from the facade, their shadow would grow from 6 foot all the way to 60 foot high. And in a very sort of intuitive way, people could begin to take over the public square, which is the Schouwburg plane. The idea with a project like this was to create a platform which was out of control. It was a very important, it still is a very important element of most of my work, that people don't tell you what to do or not to do, that you kind of find it out as you go along. And the particular example of body movies from 2001, what would happen is people would tend to match up their shadows with the portraiture and start these ad hoc animations, which would sort of occupy the presence of the portraits. So we would see all sorts of eccentric behaviors. We had a man on a wheelchair project himself 60 foot high and crush everybody under his wheelchair and derive a lot of pleasure from this. And then depending on what time of the week it was, weekends we had a lot of kids. Tuesdays was methadone night at the nearby church, so all the addicts would come and prance around. They'd set up these kinds of performances which would just sort of take place over the course of the night. And the project itself was one of our first computer vision projects. It's a very simple tracking system which would detect where the shadows are. And crucially, if the shadow was overlapping a portrait, the system would trigger a little MIDI sound, like tick, just to let you know that you had activated that portrait. And more importantly, once all of the portraits in a particular scene were revealed, once the shadows would go over these red hotspots, automatically the computer would black out and cue a next set of portraits. In a way, frustrating representation, because the piece is not about the portraits themselves, it's about becoming the portraits. So you'll see in this next scene, people actually collaborate and they sort of organize themselves in space to cover all of the portraits like they're doing, and then the computer blacks out, cues a new image, and then people reorganize in space. So they're invited to just continue the narrative. And these projects are neat in the sense that when you're working with very, very large scales like this and the budgets are intense, there's a certain expectation of catharsis and of fireworks display. But in fact, it is only when people go in and start casting their shadows that you start getting some of the action from the piece. So we've done this project in many different countries, and the first 40 seconds is always quite embarrassing because the sponsors are expecting something, and it's not until finally somebody starts activating it that something happens. The interface itself, the computer tracking system, is projected in the public space together with an explanation in Dutch and English, just so that people who are nerdy like myself can go and sort of find out how the mechanism works. We call it pretentiously the Brechtian moment, this moment where we sort of reveal the ways in which we're sort of doing all of the tracking. But the truth is that most people did not really care about the Brechtian moment. So they would start these narratives. People who did not sort of know each other would just activate the space. So she abused her boyfriend for about 3 hours. And of course, it's Holland, so there's bicycles and breakdancers and all sorts of different things. So the idea of a platform being out of control is really crucial, as I was saying, as well as the idea of self-representation. So I think she's done with him. So we have hours and hours of material about this, and one of the things also that we're interested in as we're working in public space is to create experiences which are connective, that are they have group interaction. And usually when you have group interaction, as you know, most of the time you take turns. So there's one person or a couple of people who are actually controlling the installation. The rest of the people are passive spectators. The other way to do it is there's some kind of voting interface, which is really frustrating because, like democracy, it does not allow to have eccentricity. But in this kind of installation, there's a weird hybrid because there is the total tableau of what's going on, but then you also have your own sort of presentation in it. So we feel that this is an interesting mix. And you'll notice that I keep on referring to we, and that's because I have a studio with 10 people with whom I make these developments, and so I just want to acknowledge that here, that these are all collaborative projects. So that's Body Movies, and we've done it in like I said, many cities. This is in Linz at the Hauptplatz in 2002, so we're projecting right onto the outside of the mayor's office, basically, City Hall. As you perform this in different cities, you break certain stereotypes. My stereotype of Latinos is that we are very close to each other and we always like to touch each other and hug and whatever, and yet when we presented this in Portugal, everybody was like, no, you're over there, that's your shadow, I'm not touching you, whatever. Whereas when we showed this in Liverpool, in England, my stereotype, I'd never worked in England, and my stereotype was that British were like really proper and class and stiff upper lip and whatever, and in fact what they were doing is just taking off their clothes and starting this crazy orgies and peeing all over the place. It's a learning process. So these are experiments, and what people end up doing varies from time to time and site to site. So a lot of the experiments in tracking have to do with this idea of Patriot Act and Homeland Security, of like how, if we are now arriving at a new kind of computer vision, which Manuel de Landa talks about the cameras themselves as having executive control, right? Like, you remember how art used to be made with closed-circuit TV cameras like Dan Graham or Julia Scher or so many other incredible examples. But today, the kind of art that I guess we're all making is really about the cameras themselves having our built-in prejudices. Cameras today try to detect your ethnic origin. They try and compare you to a database of suspicious individuals, so on and so forth. Drones themselves are for target acquisition. So how can we take those technologies and pervert them and materialize them and create connective experiences that are a little bit more poetic or critical? And so a lot of my work is about materializing that surveillance. In this particular case, we have a crotch tracker. So we developed just a thing that detects where your crotch is. And then as you walk into the room, there are 50 military belts that are hanging at waist height, which in fact react to your presence. So there's like a puppetry, if you will, going on. You walk into the room, and they all, this is what happens. As you walk into the room, they all just check you out. And then if you want to walk away from them, you do, and then they just follow you quite slowly. And what's interesting about a kinetic sculpture like this is that if you have several people in the room, a belt that is between you and I might actually get stuck or start doing some turbulence like an eddy. And so the movement is neither pre-programmed nor is it random. Both of these two things, I think, had their course. There was a chance for randomness, and artists used randomness very well. And predetermining outcomes was also very well used. And now we have to think of other ways to create this kind of sculptural experiences. And so it's about absence and presence and the fetish of the belt and paternal authority and whatnot. But when I made this project, I thought it's going to be really ominous and really dark and Orwellian. And I have a friend from Spain who found it really homoerotic, and I thought, sure, why not? You know, like you're like 50 guys following you, then this piece is for you. going back to this idea of self-representation, of like how can we reactivate our cities, part of my job is to talk to different politicians who want to revitalize a city center. And sadly, what these politicians mean by revitalizing a city center is putting 19th century lampposts, cobblestones, and Gap stores. So the homogeneity is just so intense worldwide that there's a few that really believe that art can disturb the normal narratives of the usage of public space, and so I believe in that too. And that what we need to seek for is this interruptions, this extremely eccentric, anti-modular moments of presence. So this is a project that the last time we did this was in Trafalgar Square. Here you're seeing it in Lincoln, where you walk around, your shadows cast onto the ground, and you find these people who are inside of your shadow, and when you see them, they wake up and they check you out. So they establish eye contact. And it's a more intimate project than body movies in the sense that the relationship is more one-to-one. But it's successful because it's the moment of eye contact is a moment of complicity, it's a moment of connection, there's a power asymmetry between you and the portrait. For as long as you're on top of a portrait, the portrait will stay checking you out. It's not like a loop, we call it scrubbing the playhead, so the portrait is just sort of fast forwarding and slowing down and just sort of looking at you. And when you're not interested in the portrait anymore, you just walk away, and the portrait goes to sleep and disappears. The idea with this project is that how do we use these projectors, which are typically used for corporate, large, Olympic-style shows, to create relationships that are a little bit more intimate. So here's this portrait knows now that he's gone, so she goes back to sleep and disappears. And then we don't know where she will appear again, if at all, in the entire place. And kind of like the Hoogstraten thing that I was showing you from Rotterdam, people do tend to be quite monstrous with the imagery. So technically, the way that the project works is it uses the world's brightest projector. I often say that my work is as big as my insecurities, so I try to use the world's biggest projector or whatever. But as you will see now, I go to psychotherapy, so I'm doing smaller things as well. In this one, we're using a 110,000 ANSI lumen projector to cast your shadows. And then we are using robotic projectors which had just come out in 2005, which allowed us to put the portraits anywhere within a 20,000 square foot area. And then the surveillance camera system, you see on the bottom right, these people are being detected, but we're also predicting where they're going to be in the future. So we're sort of seeing how they're walking, and those crosshairs show you where the person would be. And then that's important. I'm going to go out for a second, but if you look... Before Dave convinced me to do this, I asked, how big is the stage? Now, I know a good deal when I see one, and I knew I'd be having all the sympathy from you all, so I said, golden chance to hit them with 3 hours of talk. So first we're going to start with some hard research. So a lot of you are now my friends on Twitter. They're following. That's awesome. 5% of the comments said it was performance art. One called me Chris Burton. 2% of comments blame Golan. After all I said of doing what he said. 12 people want to see me fall on YouTube. And I think that this is doable, right? Because this is recorded, so we can go and put my fail right there. 2 people want me to fall during every talk. There's some cruel ones out there. Matt thought I needed to dial down the slapstick. Thank you, Laura. That is certainly the Mexican way to heal. Though I have to admit, right now I'm on morphine. So I think in the United States, you obscenely call that I'm tripping balls. And then this is a speculative one that half of you wanted me to finish the talk, so here I am. All right, just a brief reminder, tup, 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 we did that. All right. And we're in 2010, where did we leave off? All right. So it's a relatively fun project along the lines of amplification. We did it in Los Angeles at a kind of Nuit Blanche type event. You see those 2 units are sandboxes in the trussing system. And when you stick your hand into the sandbox, your hand gets projected onto the beach, 40 meters by 30 meters large. And then we have also a camera surveillance system that detects the people on the beach and projects them onto the sand. So you see those black dots? Those are the ghosts of the people who are at the beach. So you see them, and they see you, and you share 3 scales. So the human scale of being right beside them, then the huge image of special effects and sort of Hollywood-sized imagery, and then the tiny images of this kind of Petri dish style thing that happens in the sandbox itself. And in a project like this, what I was mentioning on the subject of tracking people is the idea that the projects are out of control, so that was an important element. Nobody tells you what to do or not to do. And so it ends up being really up to people to crowdsource the work and to give it a meaning. In the case of this kind of expressive platform, though it's fun and you ended up having all sorts of different kinds of relationships, we actually had like pretty ominous tracking systems on the beach. And it's LA, so people bring their doggies with booties. But yeah, those tracking systems were, straight out of what you might find at the border tracking illegal Mexicans or teenagers at the shopping mall. So
we're living in extremely lonely
this is this kind of thing. I'm just going to fast forward. This guy likes to burn people.
You're
for
texting
example.
somebody, you're sort of closed in to not connect to other people. There's, you're in your
You get the idea. This is Coca-Cola guy.
dynamic takes place. You don't really get to meet other.
Anyway, so let's go on. In the section of tracking, which is the first part of my talk, we've seen a lot of tracking systems that we've developed over the past 20 years, mostly using OpenCV and so on. And then stupid Microsoft came up with Kinect, and it's kind of devastating for someone who uses $2,000 industrial cameras and infrared systems and whatever. And then we just said, okay, let's buy a bunch of them and join every other 20-year-old, which they all should be working with Kinect. It's a wonderful technology. This piece is called tape recorders, and they're just basically Kinects tracking people. And as you go into the museum and you stand in front of a tape measure, the tape doesn't measure distance, it measures time. So as you stand in front of it, it just telescopes up, and then it, do I have sound? Yeah. And then just as you wait, it just has this tense moment where that we probably all recognize where it just crashes. So the idea of the system of control actually being weak and metaphoric of collapse. So then in this piece, after you've been there, so this is a connect, la la la, once you move away, like the tapes just recoil back and it all starts over again. Very intensely useless piece. And then, crucially, each hour, the system adds up how much time was wasted by the public and prints it out. So it gives us stats. So this is tape recorders. I'll show a section on biometrics. One of the problems with new media is that, as we all know, I'm sure nobody here defends the word new. It's really annoying and foolish. And one of the problems we have is that as soon as you do something, people ask you, well, what are you going to work on next? It's like, no, well, we've got to develop languages along the lines of something that you're investigating. So with that excuse, I've been doing a lot of recycling of sensors and of concepts along the lines of heartbeats. Of course, I'm not the first one to do this, and there are literally hundreds of examples from the history of art of using the heartbeat. But my particular contribution came from originally in 2006, a project called Pulse Room, where we had a sensor that was not unlike what you might find at a gym. And then as you hold on to it, it converts your heartbeat into just pulses onto a light bulb. This is in a beautiful 19th century abandoned factory in Mexico, in Puebla. And the way this works is, at the beginning, it starts like this. There are no light bulbs, and I can't help myself. I go first. And that's my megalomaniac heart. Then, as I release the sensor, the computer stores it as a loop, and it sends it to the very first light bulb in the array. Now, here comes a second participant, who is the mother of the sponsor of the event. And notice how her heartbeat is not just different in heart rate, it's also the attack on the tungsten filament is different. So we're really trying to envelope, we get systolic and diastolic activity, and we try and create a very unique kind of heartbeat. When she releases the sensor, the computer records it, and now it sends it to the first light bulb, pushing one position down my own. Here comes a third participant who's my friend and drinks a lot of Red Bull. This is what Red Bull does. And then again, he pushes us one down. Here comes a curator who thinks we're going to electrocute everybody. And have you ever wondered what happens inside the heart of a curator? So this is what happens. And so you get the picture. Once you have 100 people, the entire room is populated by the most recent participants. And then once 100 people participate after you, your own heartbeat disappears from the room like a memento mori, just a reminder that we're only here briefly. And a slightly romantic story, the inspiration for this project, and a lot of them, is my wife was pregnant with twins, and being a nerd, I asked the doctor to take an ultrasound of his and her heart at the same time, and we could hear the twins syncopate and create this rhythmic, patterns. And so we thought, okay, how do we sort of, out of these very individual, intimate biometrics, create something that is more akin to, like Steve Reich or Conlon Nancaro, Glenn Branca, sort of repetitive patterns that create this kind of sort of bigger piece. And then I've done this in many different ways. So I've done it with ripple tanks, I've done it with water hoses, I've done it with searchlights. This one in particular is theatrical spotlights. It's in Madison Square Park in New York City. There are 200 theatrical spotlights in the perimeter of the central oval lawn. And the same as the one in Mexico, you hold on to it, except here you gradually take control of all 200 spotlights. And so now that's your heartbeat. And then again, it records your data, and it sends you to the very, very first light bulb in the array and pushes along all the previous recordings. So this is what's happening here. And my goal with a lot of these projects is, well, how to reactivate public space in experiences that do not involve shopping? How do you get people into a space? How do you get people into the space to, to spend time, to sort of bask in this case, in the light of this participation? So that, and this is that's what I'm looking for, just people hanging out. So this is Paul's. Here's another one. This one is a little bit more ominous. This one is it's a little sensor. I love to ask people who come and visit the installation that they must insert the finger into the orifice. So I like to ask them. When you do that, there's a pulsimeter that we have there, and it does an electrocardiogram. At the same time that it does that, it detects your pulse, but it also photographs your fingerprint with all the gritty details and disgusting sweat beads and so on. And then the same as the previous projects, we're actually showing simultaneously 10,900 previous participants in the room. And they get smaller and smaller from, whatever, 12 foot high to the size of the actual finger. Also with biometrics, this is a piece that we did for the Havana Biennial. This is a woman called Omara Portuondo. She's a singer for Buena Vista Social Club. She's 85 years old. She's an absolute wonderful artist. And so what we did is we asked her to breathe into the brown paper bag. And then what we did is we connected that brown paper bag onto a device, which is kind of like an artificial respirator, that makes her breath inflate and deflate the bag 10,000 times a day, which is, according to Wikipedia, the normal respiratory frequency for an adult at rest. And the machine also sighs 158 times a day, so the machine actually goes, and the idea with this piece is that once Omara Portuondo dies, her last breath will be kept circulating between the machine and the brown paper bag. And so in essence, we're trying to capture this impossible, ephemeral sort of flow of life into this piece. And it's a funny story. This very project, we're doing it with several people. So the first one is Omara Portuondo. The second one we just showed in Toronto with American composer Paulina Oliveros. And the third one, it was acquired by the Museum of Fine Arts in Montreal. And I asked them, I said, it's a curatorial decision whose biometric portrait this is, but I suggest that for Montreal it'd be Leonard Cohen. And they said, yeah, okay, that sounds great. Then they went to the acquisition committee, and then somebody in the acquisition committee suggested that it'd be Celine Dion instead. And you have to be very careful with Celine because there is this enormous love for Celine. And I just said to them, listen, this is a memorial project. This is for people, in their 80s who have contemplated life and death. They're going to go into the machine, and we don't want to insult Celine, And they said, no, we don't want to insult Celine. So Leonard Cohen is back on. Okay, perhaps of the most serious works I've done, most of the artists that I admire, people like Krzysztof Wodiszko or Johann Goertz or Rachel Whiteread, make their best work in memorials that depict very tragic incidents. In 1968, the Mexican government massacred about 300 students in Tlatelolco Square, peaceful students, 10 days before the Olympics. And that very night, all the blood was cleaned up from the square, and nobody talked about it. The media was complicit. And for about 30 years, it was taboo to speak about this in Mexico. And now the site of the massacre is owned by the university. It's a powerful university. And they commissioned me to do the 40th anniversary memorial for this. And so I wanted to have a project which would allow participation on the one hand, but also not fetishize the sort of distant history as if that is over and we must remember it, but as a problem that is still happening. So this is what we did. Let me just fast forward. So, voz alta, which means like loud voice. As she speaks onto the microphone, her voice is beamed by the searchlight to her voice. The intensity of brightness is matched to the voice. And then it hits the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And from there is sent to the rest of the city. And in the presentation of this project, it was very touching because we had survivors of the massacre, we had neighbors, we had people just sort of talking about the situation of the massacre, but also some contemporary stuff. We had a man who said, "My name's so-and-so, and I'm a fireman, and I'm here to denounce that the government routinely asks us to put a coloring dye onto our water tanks, so when we spray protesters, they're easily identified. And I became a fireman because I believe in protecting the public, not be part of the apparatus of repression." We had a man saying, "I'm the son of one of the soldiers who committed the massacre, and I'm a new generation. I've lived with this guilt all my life." It's a very cathartic kind of mic session, if you will, where people would just, right in the same square where the massacre took place, would use this protest megaphone and then beam their voice onto the city. And then once it would hit the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, it would be beamed to in 3 directions in the city. These are 10,000 watt xenon lamps that can be seen from a 10-mile radius. So as you're driving in Mexico City or looking out your window, you would actually see this flashing lights sort of take over the city. And crucially, we radio broadcast live, without censorship or moderation, everything that people said. So you would tune in to the radio station to listen to what people were saying. And that was really important because we wanted people's participation to enter the media as well, because the media was complicit with what was happening. So in a way, the whole communication sort of circle was completed with the FM radio. And I should mention that a project like this is actually inspired by the Estridentistas in Mexico, which are the Mexican futurists who used radio itself to do a lot of their manifestos and poetry. And in particular, a poem called Magna Vox, which talks about this kind of voice to light thing, and that's in the 20s, which I find really important to. When nobody was participating, we would play back the voices of survivors and the voices of witnesses of the massacre, because ultimately this was a radio program, so if you had nothing, people had nothing to hear, and mix the past with the present. Now, of course, we also had, marriage proposals and rappers and poets and so on. It was a very vibrant piece. Okay, I'll just show this one briefly. On the subject of crowdsourcing, this is a scanner. You put your objects, the pieces called Police, empty your pockets, and then as it comes out from the conveyor belt, it records an image of itself, and then it comes back with images from the past of stuff that people have put inside the machine. So it records up to 600,000 different memories, and then just brings them out into the future. And in the months that we showed this in Manchester, we saw everything from knives to drugs to, well, you can imagine, it's quite fun to see what people leave behind. We're going to skip these two. Actually, well, yeah, we'll skip these two. I'm only showing a little bit. Then the final section of my presentation is generators. So these are the maths that we all know and love, things like cellular automata and all sorts of kind of nonlinear equations, but applied into materials. So this piece, for instance, is not actually interactive. What it is, it's 30, 40-ounce beer bottles on this table, and a cellular automata mechanism is seeded every 3 minutes. It resets, and then it creates patterns which are supposedly mimicking the ways that neuronal pathways function. So this is a really stupid brain made out of 30 connections, but sort of manifested in this kind of portrait of my dad. Again, connect. So this is a little branch that we found, and then we scan it in 3D, and then we create an L system that extends the branch to create the entire tree from where it comes. And it's just a very simple mobile. As you touch it or as it moves with the wind or whatever, the shadow of the branch is the entire tree from where it comes. And the final project I'm going to show is a complex project. It was for Inquisition Church in Mexico City, where thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people were killed by Catholics. I don't know if you're familiar with one of the mechanisms by which the Inquisition would work. At least according to Edgar Allan Poe, there's that razor that is on a pendulum that is brought down to make the heretic confess. And so it's inspired by that lovely thought. And this art center is fascinating. It's Laboratorio Arte Alameda in Mexico City, and it's dedicated only to electronic art. We should have Eyeo Mexico there. So what it is, it's a sun. It's 6 meters in diameter. It's made with Perlin noise, reaction diffusion, Navier-Stokes, with fractal flames. And then hanging from the sun is this pendulum that you can go on, and it just takes you, 60 feet along the nave of the church. And you gotta love Mexico, because this would be impossible in Canada, In Mexico, if you do that and you fall, people go, oh, are you okay? In Canada, they sue you or whatever. And then the smoke there is actually mapped smoke. So as the people walk past it, the smoke actually collects on the top of on the roof of the church. So it's kind of like a witchcraft-like piece about scale and symbols and whatever you want to call it. I don't really know. So that's Nave Solar. I'm running out of energy, so last thing is just this funny video I found. I want to show you, this is a very important Mexican, he's kind of like the Prince of Mexico. You know how Prince can do soul and rock and funk and whatever? Juan Gabriel is like that. He's just incredible.